Hello again. Welcome to the screencast of the PowerPoint for the respiratory system. This is Unit 6, the first unit in HO 152, Human Body Systems 2. Functions of the respiratory system are listed here for you. Be sure that you understand what these are. Olfaction, sense of smell. Innate immunity. This means that the respiratory system, primarily the mucus and the cilia lining the respiratory tract, provide a barrier for the entrance of foreign microbes, bacteria, viruses, and so forth. Next slide. These are the components of the upper respiratory tract. Here is a diagram of the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Make sure you understand the basic structures of each component of the upper respiratory tract as well as the lower. Here are those components listed for you. I don't need to read this to you. You are capable of reading, and if you have questions, again, the easiest way to reach me is through Moodle messaging. So questions about material are very welcomed. This gives you more of the structures. Functions of each of the structures. Again, make sure you look at the functions of each of the structures of the upper respiratory tract, as well as, of course, later on, of the lower respiratory tract, listing all of the structures and their functions. Here is a diagram showing you these structures. So again, this is from your textbook. You can look at it either here as often as you like on the unnarrated PowerPoint on your Moodle page, or in your textbook. Now we get to the lower respiratory tract and the structures included. Again, a diagram showing you the lower respiratory tract and each of the organs listed and explained what it is and what its function is. Structure and function, that is the essence of human anatomy and physiology. Anatomy, the structure, of course, physiology, the function. Again, more of the structures and their functions. Here is anatomy of the larynx from various sides. Here is the anatomy of part of the larynx, primarily the vocal folds and the relative positions, and what these structures would look like through a laryngoscope. Trachea. Notice the trachea contains cartilage. This helps to keep the trachea open, keeps the trachea from collapsing. Contains cilia. These cilia are part of the innate immune aspects of this system. Notice that smoking causes the cilia to stop functioning, and this would definitely remove one of the first barriers for entrance of foreign substances, microbes, dust, dirt, and so forth. Here is the anatomy of the trachea and the lungs, showing you how smaller and smaller segments of these tubular structures, the bronchi, the bronchioles, branch off one of another. This again tells you about the lungs. The lungs are the primary organs of respiration. Here are the air passageways. We'll also be spending a little bit of time looking at the alveoli, which are the functional units of the respiratory system, and there is some homework and forum questions involving the alveoli. Again, anatomy of the trachea and the lungs. And these are the trachea and lungs dissected from human lung tissue. More about the lungs and about what happens during an asthma attack. The terminal bronchioles are not lined in cartilage, and therefore, unlike the trachea and some of the primary and secondary bronchi, the bronchioles can constrict, and this will lead to reduced airflow. All right, functional units, the alveoli of the lungs. Notice the surface area of the alveoli. Alveoli literally means a grape-like cluster, grape-like cluster. And notice the alveoli are surrounded by a capillary network. This will become more clear as we continue. Also very important in terms of gaseous exchange between the alveoli and the blood vessels is the respiratory membrane. Notice this is the precise location of gas exchange between air and blood. And it is formed by the walls of the alveoli and capillaries. Alveolar ducts and respiratory bronchioles also contribute, and we will see the importance of this membrane and a diagram of it. So here is the membrane. Let's see if we can get rid of that little, can't really do that. All right, here is a representation of a red blood cell. Oxygen diffuses out of the red, or I should say carbon dioxide, as the red blood cell is returning to the capillary networks, to the lungs. The carbon dioxide, which was picked up in cellular tissue as part of the metabolic, we could say, waste product of active tissue. So this needs to diffuse through basement membranes, the respiratory membrane, the interstitial space between the membranes, and finally to the alveolus, so that this carbon dioxide can then be exhaled via the lungs. The oxygen likewise follows a similar passageway into the erythrocyte, the red blood cell. Take a look at this and be familiar with how this system operates, and think about the importance of the surface area as well as the thickness of this respiratory membrane. What would happen if there were reduced surface area of the alveoli because of a disease such as emphysema? Think of what might happen if the interstitial fluid were increased for some reason, perhaps due to bronchitis or other conditions. Cystic fibrosis interferes with this process of diffusion. So these are all very important concepts for you to spend a little time thinking about. Pleural membranes. Pleura refers to the lungs, the double-layered membrane around the lungs. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity, and the visceral pleura covers the actual lung surface. And the pleural cavity is the space between each lung. Here it is diagrammed for you. Here in red is the visceral pleura adhering to the lung tissue. Here illustrated in blue is the parietal pleura, and the space between is the pleural cavity, the cavity in between the membranes. This shows you the orientation of the section that was cut up on the left. All right, what is ventilation? We're going to try to move quickly through this. It is the process of breathing or moving air in and out of the lungs. It uses the diaphragm There are phases. Inspiration just means breathing in. The external intercostal muscles are involved, as well as the diaphragm. Expiration means breathing out, which uses the diaphragm as well as the internal intercostal muscles. Here it is diagrammatically. When we expire or breathe out, the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle, is relaxed and dome-shaped and decreases the, let's say, the size of the pleural cavity, the effective size of the pleural cavity. When we breathe in, and you might try it wherever you're sitting, the diaphragm flattens, and therefore the relative space in the pleural cavity increases, and air can move in because there is less pressure then in the pleural cavity. I should say also the thoracic, I'm sorry, I meant thoracic cavity. The pleural cavity is that intermembranous space. The thoracic cavity is the chest, we could say chest cavity. So thoracic cavity decreases in relative size for exhalation or expiration, and increases, the thoracic cavity increases in relative size for inspiration. Pressure changes. Let's take a look at the volume increases and decreases and what they are called. I explained that a bit before. This is what happens in inspiration, and then atmospheric pressure becomes greater than alveolar pressure, and air will move in. During expiration, we talked about some of the things that occur, the events that occur. The thoracic cavity volume decreases, pressure increases, and then alveolar pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure, and air will move out of the lungs. Here this is diagrammatically. This same diagram is in your textbook, figure 1511 to be exact. Take a look at that so you have a visual as well as a verbal and mental picture of what is going on. Lung recoil is a tendency for elastic fiber to, as it says, to recoil, and that recoil will help to push air out of the thoracic cavity. Surfactant is a fluid produced by the secretory cells of the alveoli, and it reduces surface tension or friction and helps to keep the lungs from collapsing. Pleural pressure is the pressure in the pleural cavity. And here are pulmonary volumes. They're measured by a spirometer. Take a look at it and learn these. I want to go on to the visual of this. Here are the definitions. I just have a couple of minutes left because I want to finish this in the 15 minutes that we have. Vital capacity is the maximum amount of air a person can expire after a maximum inspiration. Look at these. Here it is visually. The tidal volume, which is kind of normal breathing, and the difference between lung capacities, maximum inspiration. So take a look at the volumes as well as the capacities. These are very important in working with patients who may have respiratory diseases, very important diagnostic tools, so they will be necessary for you to look at these. Gas exchange, we looked at the respiratory membrane and the alveoli that are important in that. The respiratory membrane thickness, the surface area. The surface area of the alveoli are extremely important for normal, efficient, effective respiration. They can be reduced, the surface area can be reduced and destroyed, maybe removal of lung tissue or destruction from cancer, or the destruction of the alveolar walls and therefore surface area because of emphysema. Cells use oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. Blood returning from the tissues to the lungs is high in carbon dioxide. Blood or the alveoli are low in carbon dioxide, of course, and high in oxygen. Carbon dioxide diffuses from capillaries into the alveoli and